Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. I am your host, Rob, and I am looking forward to this episode today. A subject that, like most of us, we all drink coffee. Myself, I enjoy a really good cup of coffee, and I've seen more of these local roasters and these coffee houses pop up, but I have no clue on going in and having some kind of a little bit of knowledge on what to order, how to order, what type of bean, what type of ground, any of this kind of stuff. So we're going to call this episode kind of Coffee Basics, and I've invited a friend of mine, Tyler Martin, out to kind of go over this with me. Tyler, how you doing?
I'm good. If you don't have a clue, I may only have like half of one, but we'll see if we can give the people something to think about.
See, and I think of you as an expert, and you probably don't want to hear that.
No, that's the first caveat to all this. I am not the There are plenty of people in the city of Houston there are probably people in this neighborhood that know more about coffee than I do.
I don't know, man.
But I'm passionate about it, and I love to talk about it, so I appreciate the opportunity just to come share some of the stuff that I've picked up along the way, and we'll drink some coffee.
Yeah, and for me, I enjoy a cup of coffee. I'm in my early 50s. I've been drinking coffee for a while. And to me, it's a process kind of like if you're a wine person, getting kind of out of that sweet category and into drier wines, or if you're a whiskey person, getting out of mixing and ice or water and drinking it neat. Coffee, to me, getting out of I might offend some people here, getting out of putting sugar and cream in your coffee so you can really enjoy what the expression of that coffee is supposed to be. Kind of think all of those kind of go together in that same kind of trajectory.
I think they do, and we were talking about this for a minute before we hit the record button, but there's different categories of coffee drinkers, wine drinkers, whiskey drinkers. Most people fall into the very casual category, drinking coffee in the morning, fueling up for the day. And if you're drinking that with milk and sugar, there's nothing wrong with it.
They're getting it for the caffeine.
That's right. Yeah. And then you've got the group that maybe like me that know a little bit and are seeking out maybe some of the higher end coffees or more specialty coffee, you put it that way. And then you've got the group that are the really smart guys that know everything there is to know and
have $25,000 machines in their house
and have the huge espresso setups and That's a whole different conversation there when you get into espresso. That's very specialized.
Well, let's start with, when we think about coffee, to make coffee, you have to have the beans or the grounds.
Yep.
So let's just start with what kind of coffee should you buy and where would you suggest people buying it? Because we were having, like you said, that conversation, and you brought up a couple of things to me that I never even thought about when I buy coffee grounds.
Well, hopefully I remember this.
Well, I'll just refresh your memory. It was the date. Knowing when they were roasted makes a big difference in the quality of what you're going to get in the glass.
Yep, that's definitely true. Getting something that's fresh is definitely going to be better. So hopefully you're buying coffee within a few days or maybe a week or so from when it was roasted, and then you're enjoying it over the next month or so after that. Coffee will keep longer than that if stored properly, out of sunlight and airtight for a lot longer, and can still be enjoyed, just may not be quite as full-bodied and assertive as when it was freshly roasted. But as far as buying coffee, there's a lot of, we'll talk about different ways to brew coffee and different methods. But the one for sure thing is you can't take bad beans and make good coffee. So it all starts with buying good quality coffee. And one of the questions you had is, when we were talking earlier, is should you buy from a local roaster, or is a supermarket fine, or are there places online? And we're now seeing some local roasters put their coffee in supermarkets, which is great because it's opening the door to a lot of people that maybe never thought about buying directly from a roaster. Unfortunately, most of the time those coffees are going to be a little bit older, probably stuff that just didn't sell before, or it probably wasn't rotated very well through the store. So sometimes if I'm in the store, just out of curiosity, I'll look and I'll see things with roasted dates from 5, 6, 7 months before. And it's not going to be any cheaper at the supermarket. So there's really no need to buy it there.
So that brings up the question, when you have a roast date, what's the drink date? What's the window of, that coffee is going to hit its peak at a certain point, and then after that, it's starting to kind of degrade?
That's a good question. And I don't know. It probably depends a lot on the coffee, how it's roasted, what level it's roasted to, and the qualities that make that coffee good. Much like wine, there are certain things that when a wine is fresh may not necessarily be a good quality, but it'll mellow over time. With coffee, that's probably not going to be the case. You're not going to.
And the reason I ask that question is some people might go to Costco and go, I'm buying a huge thing of coffee.
Sure.
Because I'm getting bulk.
Yep.
But to really get what you want out of that coffee, it might be better to say, you need to buy it once a week with a roast date, or once every 2 weeks. I'm just trying to decide what kind of volume do I want to buy so I'm maximizing what I'm getting out of that coffee.
I think you're probably going to be fine at least a month out.
A month, okay.
Maybe even 2 months. If stored properly, that's the big if, stored properly, even at a couple of months, it will still be enjoyable, especially if you're mostly drinking your coffee with milk and sugar or just with milk. You're probably not really as worried about nuance anyway. So even a couple of months out. And I have some coffees that I forget about, and I come back to them, 6-7 months later, and they're still fine. They just may not be, to their full potential at that point.
So when I buy a bag of coffee, I always put it into a Tupperware container that I conceal.
Yep.
Is that what you do? Is that something you recommend, or is the bag that you conceal, is that okay?
Yeah, those bags are fine.
Okay.
And what Rob's talking about is the little 12-ounce bags that a lot of local roasters use. These are a zip top. Some of them are the fold over with the little metal things that you can bend. Mm-hmm. Those are not quite as good, but the ones that zip, they have a gassing valve to release CO2, keep the air out. Those are the ones that I leave mine in those because it's labeled.
Yeah, that's what made me ask the question, because you were telling me earlier that valve is there for a reason, because a freshly roasted coffee needs to
give up CO2.
Yeah.
Yep.
So having that, maybe my method, I need to leave it in a bag for a period of time and then transfer it to a...
You could, or honestly, the bags are just fine.
Okay.
They're just fine. That's what I still use, just the bags.
I use the other one just for convenience, because I've got a scoop that I use for 2 cups, 4 cups, whatever. But anyway, so we live in a big city, Houston, or suburbs of the big city, Houston. You live in Houston. We have how many local roasters around here? I mean, I know of maybe 2 or 3. One down in Richmond. I know Purify.
That's a good question. I've never really looked to see how many are in the city, but
we have several.
Quite a few.
In a big city, if you're in a big market like we are, there should be a few in your market.
In a big city, there will be probably anywhere from a dozen to several dozen quality coffee roasters.
When we get to people who might be listening in a smaller market, say they're 100, 150,000, do you know that if a local coffee shop, do they typically, roast their own beans?
A lot will.
Okay.
Or they may partner with another coffee shop that does and buy from them.
Is that something good to find out?
It is.
Okay.
It is. I think it's always best, and this is the case with anything, if you know where the product comes from. Yeah. And it's true in anything, really. The more specific you can get with where something comes from, generally the better the quality. That's not always going to be the case, but generally that's true. And so if you can go to a coffee shop in a small town and find out, are they roasting the beans there, or are they buying them from just a big broker somewhere? I think that's just a good thing to know. And that's not to say that coffee from a broker might not be great coffee, but I think it's just a good thing to know.
Well, let's go from where we buy coffee and then jump into what I think is the next step, is what kind of coffee. I mean, what kind of bean? Because people here, I think casual drinkers like me, one go Brazil or Colombia, right? That's where you get coffee from, but that's not the only places that you get good coffee
so
from.
Brazil is the largest producer of coffee, but there's a lot of other countries that produce a high volume of coffee, but also high quality. A lot of times those two are inversely related, but not always. Brazil is a good example. There's some very good, very high quality coffee from Brazil. Number 2 on the list for volume is Vietnam. There's not a lot of high quality coffee coming from Vietnam.
Okay.
Most of it is Robusta, which is high yield, usually goes into blends. It's high caffeine, usually double the caffeine of Arabica coffee. And so it's very popular in these tolling companies that are just making huge batches of coffee.
And before we go deeper into some of these other countries, talk about those two. You explained this to me earlier, and I thought it was very interesting. The Robusta. And
Sure. So kind of the conception is that Arabica coffee is always going to be better than Robusta. It's probably true most of the time, and surely most specialty coffee you get is going to be Arabica. These are the ones that have, the very interesting acidic notes, floral things that you're not going to get from Robusta, that has a very specific, much heavier body, taste, and like I said, double the caffeine that you're going to get from Arabica. But then even within Arabica, there's tons of different varietals. Think about it the same way as with wine. Practically all wine is made from the same species, but you have tons of different varieties that make very, very different wine. It's the same with Arabica coffee. Typica is kind of the original, the typical. It was the one that back in the day when they found it, they said this is the typical variety. And then from there, there's one called Bourbon, spelled like bourbon, named after an island in the Atlantic that, or actually, I think it's in the Indian Ocean, that it was discovered. It was a natural hybrid or mutation from Typica that people really liked. And from there, other things got crossed. There's still what people will call heirloom varieties in parts of Africa. Coffee originated in Africa from an evolutionary standpoint, somewhere in South Sudan or Ethiopia, and expanded from there. Initially into Yemen. Yemen was the first country that commercially grew coffee.
Okay.
And one of the things that evidences that, you've heard of a mocha, the drink, a mocha. It's named after the port of Mocha in Yemen, where back in the day, almost all coffee came through that port. Because it was really the only country that commercially grew coffee. This is a long time ago. And so huge history of coffee there. But,
talk about a little bit too on the two, I call them varietals. I don't know if that's the right term, but the Robusta and the, how do you say, Amica?
Arabica.
Arabica.
Yep.
Is the reason the Arabica is popular is because it's thought to be better coffee.
Generally. Yep.
Generally. But there's some risk with that one. It's more susceptible to.
That's right. Yes. So, in fact, and this is where my lack of expertise will show. There's a story, and I don't know all the details, but essentially Robusta was discovered in a rainforest during a period of time where there was a lot of disease and drought that was plaguing Arabica crops. And what they realized is it was growing a lot further down the mountains than Arabica coffee would ever grow. It grows at much higher elevations, over probably 900 to 1,000 meters and above. And they found much lower growing coffee and realized that it was much less susceptible to drought and to disease. And so that's why it kind of boomed and became a very common part of the coffee industry, especially with pre-ground coffees you would get at the supermarket, freeze-dried coffees that became very popular back in the 30s and 40s, especially during the wars.
The yield for the crops was high.
And the yield is much higher. That's the other kind of plus for that. So sure, there is definitely risk in growing Arabica, but for the most part, these small farmers, and that's one of the things that I love about coffee. For the most part, for example, these two coffees we're drinking right now, these were grown by just family farmers that produce coffee. And in some cases, they'll even process it, but other times it may go to a central processing station. But it can be traced back to an individual, a person that grew this coffee. And they take a lot of pride in it. Whereas Robusta is much more of I don't want to call it a commodity crop, but it essentially is.
Yeah.
There's examples that you could find in other crops where, there's heirloom varieties or higher end varieties that people grow and take pride in. But the vast majority of what's out there is what will easily grow, what will grow economically, high yields, that kind of thing.
Well, you mentioned we have a cup in front of us. Mm-hmm. Why don't you, during the course of this conversation, we're going to have a couple, we're going to get a little caffeine buzz going.
Sure.
Tell everybody what we're drinking and who it's from. Kind of give them a plug.
Sure. So the one that I'm drinking, and these are both from a local roaster called Purify. Just happens to be my favorite. I've been buying coffee from them for several years. Great people, great coffee. They're one of several really good roasters here. So certainly encourage everyone to check them out. But there's some other ones too that we can mention later that also make great coffee. The one that I'm drinking is from Colombia, and it is a naturally processed coffee.
Okay.
And what that means, there's different ways to process coffee. What we're actually drinking is the seed of a cherry. And in the natural process, you just take a whole cherry, leave it out in the sun, and it dries and ferments. And then you pop the seed out, wash it, and process it from there. With a washed processed coffee, what will happen is they'll go ahead and pop the seed out, mostly clean it up, and then ferment it. So there's not as much of that coffee cherry flesh that's left on it. So you get more of a kind of fermenty fruit flavor from naturally processed coffees. Washed coffees are usually a lot cleaner tasting, can still be fruit forward, but are usually will have other characteristics to them that are not kind of covered up. Some people think that natural processed coffees are a little too aggressive or maybe a little bit funky. This one I don't find to be all that funky, but
I don't either.
I really love this one. You're drinking a different coffee, actually. Okay. You're drinking one also from Purify from Papua New Guinea that is washed processed. So it's going to be, and the reason why I made that one for you, it's a little more middle of the road.
Okay.
We're going to taste some coffee later, and I don't believe I put that one in the lineup, but it's just a good middle of the road. It has a lot of the classic coffee flavors like almonds, milk chocolate, things like that. This one is going to be this one tastes like strawberries, blueberries, pastries, that kind of thing. So completely different coffee. But that's what's interesting. You can get
you make me ask the question, the evolution of coffee. You know, you think my grandparents, you know, people's parents growing up, they got up every morning, they had a cup of Joe before they went to work, you know, needed that energy boost. And they drink it for that reason. The more and more I've seen coffee, which has intrigued me, and it's made me want to kind of dive in a little deeper. I'm into wine, I'm into whiskey, and you know, when you dive into those two worlds, it's really kind of analyzing and evaluating what you're drinking, what's in the glass, and really, if you're that kind of geek in those two kind of spirits and wine. And I'm starting to think that applies to coffee now, that people are into coffee to dive a little deeper into what they have in the glass.
For sure, and I think you can, there's a lot of, and we talked about this before, there's a ton of parallels, I think, between wine and coffee. And this is one good example. There's plenty of what I would call like commodity or jug wine out there that people will buy that it may be fine, it's nothing special, but if they just want a glass of wine with dinner, that's perfectly fine. There's plenty of coffee that falls under that category too. But then the people that want to get into things that are a little bit more different or want to drill down to, you know, a specific vineyard in coffee or in wine or a specific farm in coffee, there's just a lot more to explore. And I think we live in a day and age, you know, the information age where we want to know what we're eating and drinking. We're interested in those things. Our parents and grandparents really didn't care. It came from a grocery store and that's all they knew. Yeah. And they didn't really care. It did its job, but I think we're just more
across the board
inherently interested in, I mean,
food. You know, they bought ground beef and didn't care. We buy ground beef and we want to know where that cow grazed.
Well, 20 years ago, would you have ever walked into a normal steakhouse and seen the name of the farm where the cow was raised?
Yeah.
Now there are places where not just the name of the farm, but maybe what it was fed on or how old it was. I mean, a lot of times they'll trace it to a specific animal. So we're just more interested in things like that than I think our parents and grandparents were. But we talked about this for a second. There's this concept in coffee of waves of interest. And what we're on now is called the third wave. The first wave was our grandparents and their parents, where coffee was a commodity. It was a part of the morning, and very, very rarely would you know even what country your coffee came from. More than likely, you wouldn't even know that. You would be buying community coffee or Folgers or Maxwell House, and it came from somewhere, and you had no idea where, and you didn't really care. The second wave were the kind of first wave of coffee houses, if you will, in the U.S., like Starbucks and Peet's, that made people start thinking about enjoying coffee for what it was instead of it just being, part of the routine. And then as that became much more commercialized and kind of what Starbucks is today, the pushback to that is now the third wave, where people are interested in exactly where the coffee comes from, the lots that it comes from, and enjoying, very, very specialized products. So that's kind of where we are now, at least for the people that are big into coffee. But there are people on each one of those three waves still today. There are still people that go to the grocery store, they buy Folgers, they throw it in the coffee pot
every morning
and never give it another thought. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Just like there's nothing wrong with drinking the Carlo Rossi red jug of wine. If it makes you happy, that's
Drink
the most
what you
important
like.
thing. That being said, there are certainly better things out there. In wine, whiskey, coffee, there's very few absolutes, but we can certainly say that there are better things out there than the jug wine, than the Folgers coffee, but it's a starting point to get you to something else.
You also said something to me that I thought was interesting and valid. A lot of people I see today that are into coffee, not a lot, some of the people that are into coffee, call them the coffee geek or whatever, might crap a little bit on Starbucks. And you made the point that they really shouldn't, because without that step in the evolution, if you will,
Sure,
we wouldn't be where we have these coffee geeks. They kind of
that's
opened
right.
that door.
They did, and still today, I would imagine most people that get interested in coffee, Starbucks was part of that evolution somewhere. Maybe in college, maybe even before that. It's kind of part of kind of discovering coffee, because it really is the first step from my parents brewed Folgers at home. Well, now I'm drinking a cappuccino, and that seems really fancy. And now I'm interested in learning, well, what are the different kind of espresso drinks? Where does their coffee come from? And then you evolve to, the more specialty stuff. So there's a place for Starbucks. And if you're stuck in an airport at midnight and you've got a red eye coming up in 2 hours and you need a cup of coffee and Starbucks is open, that's great.
Starbucks,
Nothing wrong
Burger
with
King,
that.
you're going to
Sure.
go to Starbucks.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you need a cup of coffee, you're going to get a decent cup of coffee there. You're not going to get anything close to what we're drinking right now. But I don't think it's meant to be that anymore. And,
Sure.
and I don't think Starbucks sees themselves as that anymore. And that's fine.
They found their niche.
Now, that being said, I do giggle a little bit when I see people talking about being big into coffee and posting a picture of a caramel frozen macchiato. Yes, there's some coffee in that, but that's
a lot of sugar.
a lot of sugar and a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
So that would be somebody big into whiskey that was very excited about Coke and whiskey.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah.
I want to touch on when we talk about roasts. I think a lot of people get confused, and I was up until a few years ago. And like I said, I'm in my early 50s. I think a lot of people think the darker the roast, the better flavor you're going to get out of the coffee. The lighter the roast, the less flavor. And it's actually the opposite.
It can be. I always laugh at the packages that say a bold roast or something like that. There are certainly people that associate those really kind of burnt. I don't really know how to describe it well, but those kind of classic coffee, what we grew up a lot with, that really dark, heavy coffee, that's what they associate with coffee. And that's the first thing that I think for me, I know it was true for a lot of people, to get past that to specialty coffee. One thing I think that you realize is that coffee is inherently acidic, and it has some sourness to it, and that's a good thing. Sourness it's a part of all the foods that we enjoy, foods and drinks and everything. And so realizing that there should be some level of sourness to coffee. Once you move past that, it makes it so much easier and enjoyable to explore coffee. But with roasting levels, the more you roast a coffee, the more generic it becomes. And that's why most commodity coffee, store-bought coffee, even Starbucks, is roasted very, very dark, because you can take relatively cheap beans that aren't anything special, roast them really dark, and they taste fine. They taste like dark roast coffee. It would be a sin to take the coffee that we're drinking now and roast it to a dark roast, I think, because you're losing anything that's interesting or unique about that coffee.
So when you say that, with a quality bean, you're saying you're taking what the goodness is and getting rid of it. With the not so quality bean, you're taking the imperfections and getting rid of that.
Right.
Okay.
That's exactly
to get down to a single note.
Yeah, I mean, eventually you're burning coffee down to where it would just taste like smoke and maybe like some bitter chocolate, very astringent, not necessarily something pleasant. But again, if you're drinking it with milk and sugar, that may be fine. Some of the coffees that we're drinking right now, like this one that I'm having, with milk and sugar would probably taste very weak, insipid, super sweet, would not be enjoyable.
Okay.
So there's a place for that really dark roast too, and some people like that. And I think that's the first, I know one of the things you wanted to talk about is how to select coffee. Knowing what roast, or at least kind of the band that you like, is important. For me, light to medium is generally going to be my favorite. And then one thing I wanted to mention that I just thought of, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a straight spectrum from light roast to dark roast where coffee is getting worse and worse as you go, because there are certainly some coffees that are better roasted medium, or maybe even a little past medium, that just works with that coffee. There are others, a lot of the really popular ones from Ethiopia, from Yukashef, that they're very floral, they're very bright. If you roast those past about light medium, you just lose all that.
Okay.
And it doesn't taste like an Ethiopian coffee anymore. So that's where a good roaster, I think, makes their money, is they know how to take a green coffee bean and make it into something great. They know what level that they need to roast to.
And you make me think of a good winemaker who says, when I have a good grape, my job is to not screw it up before it goes into the bottle. Right. So kind of a similar type of approach.
I think that's exactly right.
Bean. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. What do you say we take a break, we get another cup of coffee, and when we come back, I want to jump into types of grinds and how you kind of know what kind of grind you want to do for what kind of coffee you're trying to drink.
That sounds good.
Okay, let's do that. We'll be right back, and we'll jump into that topic. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back, and Tyler, we're going to get into grinds in just a minute, and I'll give you the leeway to kind of incorporate it the way you want. But let's talk a little bit about what you've put in front of us. You got a tasting that we're going to do.
Yeah. So what I've set up is just kind of a standard tasting or cupping. It's just 5 bowls with the exact same amount of coffee, same grind, same water. So taking as much of the kind of human element and variable out of it. So the only thing different is the actual coffee.
Okay.
And so what we'll do is we'll taste through them, and we can kind of talk about what's different and interesting about them, and then we can talk about what they actually are.
Is there a progression?
So we'll start on this end, your right, my left, and then move this way. And there's a reason.
I figured there probably was.
Yeah, and it's they kind of bounce off of each other, and it'll make sense once we go through them. But
when we were kind of getting these prepared and ready, you said something that I thought was interesting. I thought maybe we should touch on it real quick.
Okay.
You said that, and I think I might fall into this category a little bit. A lot of people think they need to drink coffee hot.
Yeah.
And you said, let me just ask you simply, not that there's a perfect temperature or a right temperature. I think everybody might be a little bit different, but having it extremely hot may not be the best way to drink coffee.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, boiling hot coffee is going to hurt.
Yeah.
But, you just can't taste anything when it's that hot anyway. If you've ever taken a bite of something that was just way too hot, you probably didn't taste anything. It's the same way with things being too cold, which is one of the things that I giggle about when I see people on Facebook or whatnot that are talking about how much they're enjoying a fine whiskey and it has a ton of ice in it.
Yeah.
You can't taste things that are cold. That's why really bad beer is served really, really cold, because you can't taste how bad it is. Let that get more toward room temperature, and you realize that it's not very good.
And I think about wines. They talk about
Exactly.
a certain temperature to drink wine so that you can really get what's coming out of that.
That's right. So for me, I'm probably the exception here. I actually love coffee when it's just a little over room temperature, maybe 90 to 100 degrees, which a lot of people would think is too cold and probably wouldn't like it. I'm also one of the strange people that does not mind room temperature or cold coffee. Doesn't bother me. If it's good coffee, that's okay with me. But I know a lot of people, and that's the exception. Most people hate cold room temperature coffee. But yeah, the more that I think you get towards that maybe 110, 100 degree window, and I've never measured my coffee temperature to see what my preferred level is, but I'm guessing somewhere in there, hot enough to still be a hot beverage, but not scalding hot, because at that point you just
and it's funny
can't
because
enjoy.
You make me think about sometimes I'll have a cup of coffee and I go, it got cold. I need to dump it out. You don't need to. I mean, if you're okay drinking it there, it's nothing wrong with the coffee.
Yeah, and you can also zap it for a second.
10 seconds in the microwave.
There's a YouTube channel that I really like for coffee. So anybody that's interested, his name's James Hoffman. He's one of probably the biggest name in specialty coffee. And he has a really, really great YouTube channel, very, very high production quality, tons of viewers and subscribers. But I think it was him. He did a test on how to reheat coffee and the best way to do it.
Okay.
And just microwaving it actually ended up being one of the best ways to do it.
Okay, simple enough.
You wouldn't think of that. You would think that's kind of a cop-out or a bad way to do it, but it works.
Okay, cool. Well, let's dive in.
Yeah.
Guide me and tell me what we're doing here.
So what we do, and we'll try to keep it out of the mic as much as possible because it's not very pleasant, but take a spoon and just get a small bit of coffee and just slurp it like you would some soup or something.
Okay.
If you go to like a real cupping, like an industry cupping, you'll hear people, they almost take pride in how loud they can slurp their coffee. But it's the same concept in wine when you kind of try to breathe in with a little bit of wine or not necessarily slurp, but, kind of
when you're tasting
aerate
wine.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the same concept. You're trying to coat your whole mouth with the coffee. So we'll just start with A and, just tell me what you think.
You said that comment about trying to slurp, and I think about when you eat ramen or some type of pho or something in an Asian country, that's a compliment to.
Oh, yeah.
To
Yeah.
slurp. Okay, is that, would I be right to think that might be a medium roast on that?
So this is a light medium roast.
Light medium.
So yeah, you're right on. And what we can do, we can taste them all and then talk about what they are, or we can just taste them all and talk about, what we're tasting and what we like about it. So this is the coffee that I mentioned is my favorite coffee, certainly that I've had from Purify here locally, but one of my favorite coffees, period. I get tons of like fruit notes, strawberry, blueberry, especially when I run this through the espresso machine. Tastes like blueberry pastries to me. And this was one of the first coffees that I tasted that distinct berry flavor that just kind of changed my mind about coffee.
People are listening going, what the hell is this guy talking about? Fruit in a coffee.
Yep.
And
well, keeping in mind that coffee is a fruit. It's a cherry. And so it kind of makes sense that it would still retain some of that flavor.
Sure.
And so I think one of the big things for me, and I think I mentioned this before, is getting over the hump of realizing coffee can and indeed should be a little bit acidic. There is inevitably there is a high amount of acid, especially in Arabica coffees. And so once that light bulb went off when I realized, okay, it's supposed to taste like that, then that's when I could really start enjoying the coffees for what they were.
Yeah, your palate kind of gets used to that, and then it allows you to pick out the other things. I think about whiskey again. I know we kind of keep using these analogies, but whiskey getting over the alcohol, the ethanol, and then because I think about people who are trying to drink it and eat for the first few times, all they get is alcohol.
Yeah, and I think anytime you do a tasting of something like this, you go to a winery and you have people tasting wine, and you've got somebody that is maybe new to it. And you've got one smart ass that goes, oh, it tastes like wine.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you've got to get past that, and then you start tasting all the other stuff. Same with coffee. I mean, yeah, coffee tastes like coffee, but then you get beyond that to what else is there.
Yeah. And I just think people, when you hear chocolate and things like that, people are going to go, okay, that kind of makes sense with coffee.
Yep.
Fruit, I think, is something that's catching people a little bit like, never thought about the fruit in there.
And that's a hallmark of lighter roast coffees generally. That's when you start roasting darker and darker, those fruit notes are kind of one of the first things to go. The floral and then the fruit is kind of what goes away.
And I'm wondering how many people didn't know, I think it's probably a large number, that coffee came from cherries.
Yeah, it's I mean, I didn't know that for the longest time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a cherry. I suppose you can eat coffee cherries raw, but I don't think they would be very appetizing.
Yeah.
I think they're very bitter and sour. But yeah, I don't know what person in history figured out that you could take the seed from a fruit and dry it and grind it and make it into a beverage. But
yeah, how long?
It was a visionary.
Coffee's been around how long?
A long time. I think there's. I don't remember exactly.
It's not the last 100 years, 150 years that somebody figured that process out.
No, yeah. Over 1,000 years that people have been drinking coffee.
So I just think it's very interesting to your point that somebody figured that out.
Yeah.
Kind of like beer with grains.
Yep. And it's a little different from, say, wine, where people realized, hey, I left this grape juice sitting over there and it kind of tastes interesting now.
Yeah.
And it's preserved it and it didn't go bad. With coffee, I don't know how that evolution happened.
Yeah. Somebody had to intentionally try that.
Yeah. And I think the story is that it was shepherds in the Middle East they figured out that if you dried it, you could eat the beans and it would keep you awake when you're tending your sheep late at night. They realized there's something about this that keeps me awake. I imagine it progressed from there to, well, what if we ground it up and made it into a beverage that tastes better than this really
seems
bitter
like a natural
thing?
progression.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's true, but that seems logical.
From a taste standpoint, I'm sure it was better ground up and over some liquid.
I've eaten raw coffee beans before, and it's not nearly as good as the coffee.
Okay, we're getting into we have 5 little samples that you've put out here.
Yeah, and I think you'll see a difference with this third one from the first 2.
Yeah.
So whereas the first 2, this one, a lot of fruit. This one to me is very soft, maybe some chocolate, nuts.
That would be the first thing I would say.
This one's getting kind of smoky and a more bitter chocolate, a little bit more astringent than, there's not a whole lot of acidity to me.
Not a lot of acidity at all, and the bitter chocolate is something that stands out to me.
Especially if you go back from that one to this one and notice the difference in acidity. Back to the first, it's absolutely night and day between those 2. And now these are all 3, quality specialty coffees. So that's not to say that any of them are better or worse. I prefer this first one. It's just what I like. But there's plenty of people that would drink this third one and love it.
Okay. But all of these are in your cabinet.
They are.
You enjoy all of these to a degree. That one's just your favorite.
Yes.
Kind of like wine.
That's exactly right.
You drink all kinds of varietals, but you might have a favorite.
Yep. Or something like whiskey. You've got the ones that are, the sipping whiskey and the mixing whiskey. So, these first 2 are ones that I'm going to enjoy black, as they are. This one, if I wake up one morning and I just kind of want a little bit of milk in my coffee, maybe I throw that in a French press.
I think about as we're doing this, and you're kind of, when I talk about wine or whiskey with other people, and there's those trigger words that somebody else might say, and picking out things that I don't know I'm getting till you say that word, and then I taste it again. I just had that first one, and the first time I had it, I didn't get the fruit. You said it after I tried it. Now I had it again, and I go, okay, now I'm starting to get some of that fruit flavor.
And specifically, there will be some coffees you try that taste like a citrus sour. That to me is more like the tart that you get from maybe a cherry or a raspberry.
Yeah.
It's that kind of fruit
Absolutely.
sour. This coffee was eye-opening the first time I had it. Absolutely love it.
And I didn't realize how good it was. I mean, the first time I had nothing to compare it to. So when
that's why these are so great, because you can move back and forth and you really start to notice things that you really wouldn't otherwise. Right. So moving on to the fourth one, this one is another kind of a change of pace. especially from the third one. Love this coffee as well.
That's good. I mean, I like them all. It's just, it's a subtle difference. It's not a major difference on this one. To me, it's not as bitter as the third one.
For sure. A little bit less bitterness. This one, to me, has a little bit of maybe more dark stewed fruits, but also a little bit of kind of a tropical, maybe like a pineapple mango type thing. It's maybe, if any acid that's there is more like that.
Yeah.
It's certainly more acidic than the third one.
Right.
Not quite as acidic as the first.
Agree with that. Very interesting little tasting that we're doing for somebody who's trying to get into coffee. And I mean, I'm trying to think of a way somebody might be able to do this at home, because I think this exercise is good for somebody to figure out what they might like.
Agreed. And there is a great video. James Hoffman, this is where I learned this from, has a great video about this. If you just go look up James Hoffman coffee cupping, and he'll talk about the method to do this. It's very, very simple. We basically just have 8-ounce bowls, about 12 grams of coffee, 200 grams of water. You let it steep for about 4 minutes. Stir it really gently and scrape off what's on the top to leave it clear like this. That'll stop the brewing process. All the grounds just settle to the bottom. And like I mentioned, you've taken out most of the human element here. Everything is pretty much the same. So you can see, and from this, hopefully you can walk away and say, okay, I really like this type of coffee, or this is more my preference.
Yeah, I think this exercise will absolutely get you there. I think that you may not dislike any of them.
Sure.
You may just like one more than the other, or two more than the others, or something like that. Because we're through 4, and I've actually enjoyed all of them for slightly different reasons.
And as you mentioned, it's great to be able to compare them, because I would imagine if you brought a bag of any of these home, you'd go, yeah, it's good coffee. I really enjoy it.
Yeah.
But you may not be thinking, why do I enjoy it, or what's different about it? Whereas now you can go, okay, this one is more acidic and more fruity, this first one. But maybe I prefer this one that's a little bit more nutty, milk chocolate, the second one. That kind of guides you towards what you enjoy. Hopefully there's something kind of grabbing you.
Let me ask you this. Wine and whiskey, mood drives what you want to drink.
Very much so.
Coffee, same way?
I think so.
Okay.
Now, for a lot of people, me included, I find a particular coffee from a particular roaster I like, and that's my daily coffee.
Okay.
Now, there may be a morning that I say, yeah, I'm more in the mood for this, but for the most part, especially I buy 12-ounce bags, try to get through them relatively quickly so they're fresh. So I'll usually stick with a bag for a little while, maybe switch it up a little bit, but so it may not be every morning grabbing a different bag because of a different mood, but there will be times where maybe on the weekend, I go, I haven't had that one in a while. I'm going to pull that one down.
Okay.
Or I'm more in the mood for espresso this morning. It's Saturday morning. I'm going to make some flat whites or something. I'll really like the way this one performs there.
So let me ask you another question. When we think about wine, sometimes we drink a particular wine based on what we're eating.
Mm-hmm.
Does that ever influence coffee?
I'm sure that it
To the
will.
real nerds?
Yes.
Okay.
For me, not so much. Generally, if I'm drinking coffee with breakfast, I want something more like this first one that's a little more acidic.
Okay.
More acidic coffee, I think it gets your mouth watering. It kind of is a better pair for food, especially most breakfast food is very rich. If you're having like toast and runny eggs or something,
Yeah.
I think a more acidic coffee to me would be a much better pair than a heavier, darker roasted coffee.
And I was thinking about that type of meal, because eggs are typically
Classic.
breakfast. Yeah. Versus somebody who said, today we're going to have, some French toast with a little brie with a red wine syrup reduction over, something like that. Do you go, okay, now when we get that sugar in there, we're going to go to a different type of coffee?
You might. And you might say for something like that, let's go something classic like a cafe au lait. Let's
Okay.
keep it in the French spirit. And for that, you want something maybe like this third one that's a little bit heavier bodied, can stand up to milk and sugar, or just milk if you prefer it that way. So yeah, I mean, you can certainly kind of play with your coffee and pair different things. But for me, it's not kind of first and foremost. Again, I'm usually kind of working through a bag. And so if I'm having coffee with breakfast, it's
Yeah.
whatever I'm working on.
I don't think most people would. I just didn't know if there were those, I'm saying nerd as a compliment, that do that.
For sure. And I know there's cafes that will actually pair certain different pastries with different coffees, things like that.
That's interesting. Number 5.
It is.
There, I almost get like when you talk about fruit, something that just came to mind was like a pear,
Okay.
which is kind of didn't expect that.
Yeah. And I can
A
definitely
little
see it from
sweetness
that one.
to it.
This is a very, very interesting coffee. When I tell you what it is,
It's almost like on the back of the palate, I'm just getting this burst of kind of freshness to it. This
Okay. Interesting.
kind of brightness to it.
Okay.
It's it's not heavy.
So move from this one back to maybe this first one and tell me just from an acid level, kind of where you think this last one falls.
From an acid level,
Yeah, just thinking not necessarily the
I don't-
flavors, but
I don't think there's any acid at all.
there's practically none.
Okay.
Yep. Very, very, some bitterness, but very, very little acid.
Yeah, not at all. Very soft.
Yep. And so this one, there's a very specific flavor that you get from this that's almost a bit like rubber, which
Really?
doesn't sound like a good thing, but
Not a burning rubber necessarily. When you say rubber, I'm trying to visualize or kind of with my senses think of what that would be.
it's something that's almost synthetic tasting to me.
Okay.
Very earthy. Yeah, it just has a little bit of
Is that in a bad way, good way? Do you like this coffee? Not your favorite?
I think it's a very interesting coffee.
Okay.
It's not one that I would drink regularly because I just like more acidic coffees.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting example of coffee.
Okay.
So
It is and all are all of these from the same producer?
no, they're not.
Okay.
Nope.
So they're different.
So the first two are
Well,
from.
Hold on. Let me see.
okay.
Is number 2 the one I had earlier?
It is.
That's
well
what I
done.
thought, yeah.
Well spotted.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's what I mean. It's very middle of the road. There's not a ton of acidity. There's not a ton of dark, heavy flavors. It's just a little bit of nutty, a little bit of chocolatey. Just a very, very pleasant coffee.
Yeah.
Enjoy that one very, very much.
I do too.
Yep. Great coffee.
So those are from Purify.
The first two are from Purify. This next one is actually from a roaster in Arkansas. And I'll just go ahead and walk through what these are. So the first one is the Purify Finca Villa. That is it's one of my favorite coffees I've ever had. It's from Colombia. It is the natural process. So you get a little bit of, it's very fruit forward, not washed, and can be a little bit more funky. When I mentioned to you earlier before we started, if I see a local roaster that's doing like a natural Ethiopian or a natural Colombian, I'll go buy that because I know I like those.
Okay.
They're usually more acidic, fruit forward. And so I've had enough to learn that's what I like. And that's kind of the whole point of all this is you kind of figure out maybe
Sure.
the producer or the area or the type that you really like. So B is also from Purify, from Papua New Guinea. It is wet processed, which is a form of washed. So that's why it's a little bit cleaner. There's not a whole lot distracting there to it. Both of these are a light medium roast.
Okay.
Now, I will say you've got to be careful with what's on the bag from a roast level. This is not anything that's quantifiable. It kind of is, but people play very fast and loose with roast levels. I have ordered coffee before that is described as a medium, and you get it, and it's like this last coffee that's super, super dark.
Sure.
And so you have to be a little bit careful with it. If you buy from good roasters, reputable roasters, at least you can learn their light medium is this.
Okay.
And so at least you know that lane that it'll be in. And I think most really high quality specialty roasters will fall into that band. That's the problem though sometimes with ordering offline if you don't know who the roaster is or the way that they roast, it might be a little bit of a mixed bag.
That makes sense.
The best example is, out of curiosity, Amazon did a single origin coffee back during kind of the height of the pandemic, April, May last year. And it was like $9 for a 12-ounce bag.
Which is cheap.
Which is very cheap. All of these are probably more in the 14 to 16, 18 range for a 12-ounce bag. So I said, okay, I've got to try this. It was labeled as light medium roast from Colombia or Costa Rica, I forget. And the beans were almost black.
Really?
Yeah. So that told me everything that I needed to know. It was, they had bought really cheap beans, had been roasted way too long, probably had bought them from somebody that screwed them up, honestly.
Yeah.
And it was terrible. But that's why you have to be careful. I would advise not buying whole bean coffee from the Amazon Basics lineup.
It sounds like, too, understanding what you should pay for a quality 12-ounce bag. Just to put it in perspective, people who go, man, that seems way expensive. Again, I can go to the grocery store and buy this bag. We've already went over quality there.
That's 3 drinks at Starbucks.
That's what I was going to say.
And a 12-ounce bag.
How many cups?
Roughly. That would probably be, they usually last me a couple of weeks.
And you're drinking 2 cups a day?
Cups 2 cups a day, yeah.
24 cups?
Somewhere in there. I mean, I could...
50 cents a cup of coffee?
I could do the math on exactly what it would be. But, yeah, I mean...
$1 a cup if you get, depending on how many. Yeah.
You go to Starbucks a few times and you have more than paid for that for much, much better coffee.
And I also want to say that, when you get into, and we haven't talked about it, maybe to be a future episode, but the types of cups that you can get from a drip, from a pour over, from a French press, to me, I'll say it this way. I enjoy cooking a lot. And one of the ways to cook that I enjoy is to smoke out back to barbecue. And one of the reasons I enjoy that is the process of sitting outside all day and tending to your meat and whatever. Coffee to me, I think, is kind of the same way. I've found that having a pour over now, the process of making that and smelling it and getting that is kind of the enjoyment of drinking that cup of coffee.
For sure. And I think it for me and for a lot of people just becomes part of the morning routine.
Yeah.
And just kind of going through that process is just kind of part of getting up and getting moving. Yeah, I just did the math. It's 17 to 20 cups based on the cups we had earlier with the AeroPress. That would be 17 to 20 cups.
And at $16,
$16,
you're $1, right around $1 a cup.
Yep. So it seems expensive, but for high quality coffee, it's certainly not expensive.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure people understood that when you kind of break it down, so that they know I'm really getting a pretty good deal here.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right. So the third one, like I said, it's a roaster from Arkansas called Cultivar. It's from Guatemala. It is a dark roast, and it certainly is. If you go look at the beans, they are very, very dark. It's a washed process, so it's very clean. This would be a good one for somebody that prefers or has mostly drank dark roast coffee and likes the, quote, bold coffee.
Sure.
To segue from there into other specialty coffees, I think that might be a good option, something like that. D is from a roaster in England that James Hoffman is a part of, called Square Mile Roasters. This one is from Ethiopia, and it's a natural process. And this is one of my other favorite coffees. A lot of tropical red fruit, that kind of thing. I really, really like that one. I think I mentioned like mangoes and pineapple. That's what I normally get from that one. Also a light medium roast.
Okay.
So this is where we get to the last one, and this is where it gets interesting. The first 4 we've drank are all Arabica.
Oh.
This last one is Robusta.
Okay.
Now, this is a high-quality single estate Robusta, which is pretty rare. Most of it is commodity and just gets sold in bulk to these big roasters like Maxwell House and Folgers. So it's a washed process, which is also unusual for Robusta because washed process is a lot more expensive. You use a lot of water. This one's from Uganda. So most coffee comes from a lot of coffee comes from places where water is not in ready supply. So water is very expensive. The labor to go through the wash process is a lot more. Usually you're not doing that for Robusta because you're not going to get as high of a price for it down the line. So why would you put more money into it now? But this is an example of how good Robusta can be. Mm-hmm. But I also taste that in that tastes like cheaper coffee to me. It immediately triggers almost like instant coffee. It has that kind of note.
And to me, it's very thin.
Yeah.
And is that because of the dark roast?
So this one actually is a medium roast.
It's a medium roast.
But look how dark it is
It
compared
is
to these
dark.
other ones.
Yeah.
But usually, and part of this is just a product of the way that we brewed them. If you brewed this at a higher dose in something like a French press, it would make very heavy, full-bodied coffee.
Okay.
It doesn't come through quite as well on this. But yeah, it'll make very, very strong, bold coffee, which, again, if you prefer your coffee with cream and sugar, this would stand up to that very well, whereas this first one would not be good at all.
Sure.
That's the one that I mentioned earlier would just be overly sweet, washed out. You wouldn't really taste much. This last one would still taste like strong coffee.
Sure.
So if that's the way that you prefer it, then that might be the better option.
Well, let's transition from these coffees into the grinds of coffee.
Okay.
Because, I mean, people who've went to the grocery store or wherever, or a coffee shop, whatever it might be, where you can get beans and grind it yourself there. There's that dial.
Yep.
And they try to put a few pictures on there that, ask you what kind of coffee you're going to do, how you're going to use it to set the dial. Talk a little bit how important grind is for style of coffee that you're brewing.
Grind is so important that when I tell people, when they have questions about what to buy, if they want to start brewing coffee at home, I tell them you should spend $100 to $150 at a minimum on a grinder, but you can spend $20 on the brewer.
Okay.
The grinder is that important.
Okay.
And it's important to grind fresh. All these we ground right before we brewed them. I didn't even grind them. I could have ground them earlier today at home, but I think it's that important to grind fresh.
Okay.
And so, yes, you can do that at the grocery store. And if you don't have a grinder or maybe in the process of getting one, that's fine. But my biggest advice, if you're looking to start enjoying really good coffee at home, is buy a grinder. Even if your budget's more limited and you just want to get a hand grinder, that's fine too. Biggest advice is don't use a blade grinder. They're terrible.
Oh, okay.
Do not use them.
So people who use, I see some people who use
A spice grinder.
Yes.
Yes. And so the reason for it is coffee is all about consistency. The more consistent the grind is, the better the coffee will be and the more consistently you can make good coffee.
Okay.
A blade grinder is inherently very inconsistent. If you go grind it, you'll see big chunks. You'll see a lot of essentially powder. It's called fines. You don't want that because that'll clog your brew. Whatever brewer you're using, that will turn into like a sludge and just clog the whole thing up.
Okay.
So biggest advice is don't use a blade grinder. And if your budget's a little more limited, the hand grinder that we use for this is called the Timomore C2. It's like $70.
Okay.
Because you're the motor. You're not paying for a motor, so it's a little bit cheaper, but still has good burrs. But I think for anybody that's looking to invest in a home setup, the one that I usually recommend is called a Baratza Encore. I think they're $130 to $140 online normally. And there's a few places around town that carry them, including Purify. Actually, they sell them for the money. I think it's the best grinder you can get. In fact, somebody on Facebook the other day asked for a recommendation. I said that, and our friend Wade piped up and said, "I've had that for 20 years."
Yeah.
And the on-off switch stopped working, but I just plugged it into an outlet that has an on-off switch, and it still works great.
Yeah.
So they're built really well. They grind very consistently, and I think for $130, $140, it's a great investment, especially if you can use it for that long a period of time. So I know that wasn't your question was more what grind level to go for different types
but I
of
think
brewers.
that was important too, because people go, okay, if I'm going to start grinding my own beans, because it sounds like don't buy coffee already ground. Yep. You want to buy the bean,
whole bean, if at all
yourself.
possible.
Okay.
Yes. It's going to stay fresher longer. What makes something go stale is exposure to air. So the more surface area, the quicker it's going to go stale. It kind of makes sense. So if you can keep it whole, it's your best chance of keeping it fresher for longer. Okay. And then there's all the oils and chemicals inside the coffee that as soon as you crack it open, it starts releasing that. Just like fresh ground pepper, anything like that, the fresher you can keep it, the
Sounds
better.
like a good comparison might be if you have a big red crisp apple, you take a bite out of it, wait 30, 40 minutes, you start to see the air kind of
Sure,
affect
it's
it.
starting to oxidize. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. So that's my biggest
Coffee being the
advice.
same way.
There's tons of different brewers, different methods, different coffees. I think the biggest advice is invest in a decent grinder.
Okay.
That will make more difference than anything else. You don't have to go out and buy, expensive brewers, expensive coffee pots, any of that stuff. I think buying a quality grinder is the best bang for the buck when you're getting into coffee.
So going through, and we don't have to dive deep into it, that might be another episode, but just types of grind. If you're going to use just a drip coffee maker at home that you have, a Krups or whatever it might be, grind for that, grind for a pour over, grind for a French press, which I'm assuming might be a little more coarse, but go ahead and talk about those a little bit.
So what's interesting about that question is there's not a right answer.
Oh, really?
No, because brewing coffee, you're just extracting something, using a liquid to pull something out of a solid or dissolve things out of a solid. So that is a function of the size of the grind. The more surface area, the easier it is to extract. The time that the water is in contact with the coffee, the longer it's in contact, the more it can extract. The temperature of the water, the hotter it is, the faster and more efficiently it will extract. And then just the dose that you're using, the ratio of coffee to water. So if you change the grind size and make it finer and it extracts faster, you could also drop the water temperature or drop the contact time.
Okay, this is absolutely a science to this.
It can be, and so it's a little bit of trial and error. And so the brewing method that I usually recommend for people getting into it is called the AeroPress. They're like $25 to $30. It's just a plastic chamber. You load coffee into it, you pour hot water onto it, let it sit for a couple minutes, and then using a plunger, you push it through a filter. What's great about it is it's a mixture of two different brewing methods. So you can brew coffee via percolation or infusion. So what we've done with these cups is infusion. You're just infusing the coffee into the water, just like you would with tea.
Yeah.
Percolation is where you're forcing coffee through water. So that's where your contact time gets a lot more difficult. You're managing the contact time via the amount of coffee and the size of the grind.
Okay.
So the finer the grind, the harder it is for water to flow between the pieces. And so you'll get more contact time.
Okay.
So in something like a V60 or Chemex, your pour over, your grind size is so important because you can't change the contact time any other way. Not really. It's just going to flow through there based on gravity. You can't really change anything. AeroPress, you can use almost any grind size you want. And if you change the other elements accordingly, make great coffee. Okay. In fact, there's a website where you can go in and hit it's like a random tumbler, and it will make a random recipe for you for an AeroPress.
Really?
Based on like changing all the variables. And so you can go anywhere from very, very coarse down to almost espresso grind and make great coffee out of an AeroPress. There's not any other brewers that you can do that with. So to me, for somebody getting into it, and still I have several different coffee brewing implements at home, including an espresso machine. I use the AeroPress more than anything else. I think it makes great coffee. You can make all different kinds of coffee that are great. But the biggest thing is it's cheap. It's easy to travel with. In fact,
that's what I was just going to mention.
I brought my travel kit. It's an old toiletry kit that I converted into a coffee kit that has a grinder, a spoon, my AeroPress, some coffee, the filters. All I need is a way to boil water and a cup to put it in. Yeah. Which just about any hotel room you're going to be able to do that.
So do you have two of those AeroPresses? One that stays in that package, and then one that you use at home? Or
nope, that's the only one that I've got.
Pack it up when you go.
I just pack it up whenever I go somewhere. Much to the ridicule of my wife, she thinks it's funny when I take my own coffee and coffee brewer, but hey, I like good coffee.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, there's tons of different ways to brew coffee. For percolation, that's most forms of coffee brewing. So that would be your pour overs, the V16 to Chemex being the two most common. You mentioned you were thinking about getting a Chemex. They're great. Lots of people really love those. I have a V60.
They are pricey.
They're a little more pricey, and so that's kind of the downside to them. The Hario V60 is a little bit cheaper, but still not really cheap, I would say. Then you've got espresso is a form of percolation brewing. You're forcing at very high pressure water through a puck of coffee. Something called a mocha pot, which a lot of people refer to as like a stovetop espresso maker. It makes very strong coffee, but it does not make espresso. They're not the same thing. The whole point of espresso is to use the smallest amount of water to extract the most out of a lot of coffee. So you may have a 2-to-1 brew ratio in espresso where you use 20 grams of coffee and you get 40 grams of final coffee out of it. Most everything else is going to be like a 1-to-14, 1-to-16 ratio of water to coffee. So espresso is just its own animal.
Well, I want to mention we're kind of starting to talk about some equipment and things that we use for coffee. I want to mention that two things. One, talk about French press, and I mean, I heard that, and I just thought it was a cool way to make coffee. So that's kind of how I got into it, not really understanding what's the difference there and using a French press versus a pour over, what you might get more out of that or whatever. But also another important piece of equipment I think you would recommend to people to get, which is that electric kettle.
Yeah, so the three things that I think you have to have, regardless of what other route you decide to go, are a good grinder, an electric kettle. Stovetop is okay too, but electric's just very convenient, and they're not really that. They've gotten very inexpensive now. In fact, just ordered one the other day off Amazon for like $35, and it does its job. And there's no bells and whistles, but it does its job just fine. And the third is a set of electric scales. I think that's incredibly important for a few reasons. One, because if you go online and say, how do you make good coffee with this type of brewer, you're going to find, okay, this much coffee, 20 grams of coffee to this much water. You've got to have a scale to know what that is. You're not going to be able to eyeball what that is.
Right.
Second is, if you make coffee that you love and you say, this coffee is great made this way, if you don't have a scale, it's really hard to duplicate that.
And the other thing I would say is from a cost standpoint, you don't want to waste coffee.
That's right.
So making sure if you're going to make one cup, using the right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. And I laughed a little bit earlier when you mentioned putting coffee in a container and using a scoop. I hate scoops because that's not a unit of measure.
Yeah.
It's one scoop for one person is so different from another. Now, if you know that every time I do this scoop, it's this, then that's great. That's fine.
Yep.
But the scale is important because if you go online and you see a recipe that says 3 scoops of coffee, what does that mean?
Yeah.
You know, unless you happen to have the exact same scoop as that
for the
person.
last 25 years.
That's right. Like my wife's great-grandmother, who all her recipes, when it said a cup, it was actually the top of a thermos that was like 6 ounces.
There you go.
Yeah.
Not even half a cup.
And then the third reason that it's great to have a scale is kind of the inverse of the second point. If you make coffee that's terrible and you go, wow, that's really sour, I don't like that. If you don't know what you did before, it's hard to not do it again. So you can get great scales off Amazon.
Making notes is important.
Keeping notes on what you do. I've got a notebook at home that I do that with, especially with new coffees, and say, you know, what works, what doesn't work. Especially dialing in a grinder for like espresso, I'll take notes of all that.
And I want to make sure you talk about the importance of using grams and milliliters and not ounces.
Yeah. We as Americans love our imperial system. We hate the metric system, and I'm the same way. I can't get my head around what a kilometer is, but I know that a gram of coffee is the same as a gram of water. A milliliter of water is 1 gram, so that makes it incredibly easy. When I say 1-to-16, there's no conversion of fluid ounces to volume ounces. It's all the same, and it makes the math a lot easier. Yeah. If I say I want to brew 60 grams per liter for this coffee, I can scale that very, very easily. So my scale is always set to metric and in grams. I just think it's the easier way to do it.
For cooking, I agree with you. Baking and everything, grams is the way
without
to
a doubt. Yeah. If we're doing any kind of cooking or baking, I try to find recipes that are in weight, not in volume. Yep. Volume is especially in something like baking, you know, a cup of flour in one place is not a cup of flour somewhere else. Yeah. So anyway, I think those 3 things, a good grinder, a set of scales, and an electric kettle will make anything else you buy will make it them better.
Question on the electric kettle.
Mm-hmm.
Does the spout make a difference to you? Do you have a preference?
That's a really good question. So especially with pour overs, what you'll see people mostly using is called a gooseneck, and it's that long, thin spout. And those are helpful because they pour slower and they pour more consistently. And that's helpful with a pour over because there's a lot of human element to how quickly you pour the water in. And there's tons of techniques out there that we won't get into that people argue this way is better than another. And so they're great for that. I don't do as much pour over as I do other methods, so I don't have a gooseneck.
Okay.
And we don't have a lot of room for a ton of kitchen stuff, so we just have one kettle, and it's not a gooseneck. Plus, my wife likes to make a big pot of tea, and so something that's pouring out at 20 milliliters a second is going to take forever to fill a teapot up. Or if you're making some kind of instant noodles, or if you're making a French press, or if you're doing something like this, filling them up is just annoying with a gooseneck. But they're great for a pour over. So yes, it matters, but that's where it's great to know how am I going to be using the kettle, and then you can go from there. You can find ones that have variable temps, and the one that I have it goes anywhere from I think 160 degrees to boiling at 10-degree increments, which is great. It's also fine to just get one that will only boil. There's a lot of discussion out there about what the ideal brewing temperature for coffee is. You'll hear a lot of people say 180 degrees, 200 degrees. Personally, I think boiling or just off the boil is perfect because I like lighter roasted coffees, and lighter roasted coffees are inherently more difficult to extract. So you want as much heat advantage as you can get. So boiling water is fine.
So people who think boiling the water is actually, burning the coffee is not true.
It's not true. Yeah, you're roasting coffee at 450 plus degrees, and you're cooking it to well over the boiling point of water. So boiling water is in no way going to change the chemical makeup of your coffee.
Okay. Let's obviously not a necessity. You went through the grinder, the kettle, and the what was it? Scale.
Yep.
That you need to have. But a French press. A lot of people see that.
Yep, you asked about that. Sorry.
No. But that's not a necessity. This is a luxury. This is something, if you want to try it, a process that you can use. How do you like it? Are you a fan of it?
There's some things I like about it. What's interesting about a French press is it has this kind of mystique as being a very fancy, high-end way, because you go to a fancy restaurant and they come out with a cart and they make the French press. To me, I don't want to call it an inferior way to make coffee. I think there are better ways to make better coffee than with a French press. That being said, it still makes great coffee if you know how to use it. And what we did here with these bowls is the same method as a French press. We just didn't put the little plunger in it.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's the same exact thing. We do use it at home. What's great about it is you can make 3 or 4 cups at a time. So if you and your significant other both want some coffee, you can make a big thing of that. Okay. So they certainly have their place, and we have one at home that we use. The knock on them is they'll make sludgy coffee sometimes. So you get to the end of your cup and there's like some sludge at the bottom.
Is that a bad thing?
For some people it is. For some people are kind of turned off by it, but it's really not a big deal. It's not going to make your coffee worse.
Like sediment in the wine, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
Some people are a little turned off by it. I mean, there are people that, if the wine's not properly decanted and at the end there's some sediment in their glass, they're like, I don't want that.
Oh, yeah.
But
I'm like, that's good stuff.
Yeah. But some people, it weirds them out a little bit.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, French press is great. It's very it's forgiving in the way that you brew. Certainly more forgiving, I think, than a pour over. Because again, you can use different grind levels, and just depending on what level grind you use, you may use hotter water or cooler water. You may increase the contact time. You may change and do a little bit more or less coffee. So I think it's definitely more forgiving than some other methods.
So what I've gotten out of this conversation with you is that I thought to make really good coffee at home, it's a process, and it's really not. It's fairly simple. It's about having the proper coffee, the beans, the proper grinder, and then hot water.
Just water and ground coffee. That's all it is.
That's really all it is. When you start getting into espressos Now we might get into a whole different category of what you need in machines and things like that, where you're going to have some costs associated with doing something like that.
Sure.
As far as coffee.
Yeah, and I think you can have really, really great coffee at home for less than $150.
Yeah.
I mean, $200 at the max if you're getting a decent kettle, and that's not a big investment for something that's going to
long term.
Yeah, long term that's going to bring a lot of enjoyment, make your mornings better or your evenings better if you just want to sit down and have a cup of coffee after dinner.
And if you're buying coffee at a coffee, and I don't want to take away from buying coffee at a coffee shop. I mean,
sure.
I think they're great, and there's some that I go to that I enjoy.
Yep.
Just going there and getting a cup of coffee. But to be able to make it at home, the savings you're going to have over the course of a year, that $200 investment, it really, the ROI on that is pretty quick.
Oh, for sure. And so to kind of contrast that with espresso, to buy new, I think you're looking at a minimum of probably $600 to $700.
Wow.
And preferably more like $1,000 to have just a solid entry level espresso setup. But there are machines that are $20,000, $25,000. There are grinders that are $1,000 to $3,000. Kind of the sky is the limit when you start talking about espresso, and there is a huge diminishing return when you get to that type of stuff.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I mean, I saw you having a conversation on one of our Facebook pages where the guy made a good comment. He kind of said what I think a lot is, I want to buy it once. I don't want to buy an entry
once,
level.
cry once.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to approach something like this, because what you'll find is if you buy something cheap, one, you kind of get what you pay for, especially in coffee grinders. If you go buy a $50 grinder and you quickly realize, I want something better, you've kind of wasted that $50. You might as well have spent $150 in the first place.
Yeah.
So, or $200 or whatever it is. So for me, you don't necessarily have to go spend a lot of money, but it's worth doing some research and spending enough money to get something that's going to perform well, that you're going to enjoy using. Because at the end of the day, if you spend $200 on bad coffee gear and you just don't like it and you give up after a month, then that's a worse investment than spending maybe a little bit more or making better choices and loving it and using it for a while.
Yeah, because the whole point is to start making coffee at home. And
that's right.
If you do what you just said, then you're not doing that.
That's right.
And so that's the goal.
That's exactly right. So for me, we don't have to get too much into espresso, but in case anybody's wondering, I've got the Breville Barista Express. It does have an integrated grinder, but I upgraded, was able to find a really good grinder. Normally retails for about $700 that somebody was selling secondhand. I got it for $150.
Holy cow.
So you can find good things out there. The machine is fine. I think it's the one I still recommend to people to learn on, because it has the grinder. It's a good enough grinder, and it's a good machine, and it's good to learn on, and you haven't spent quite as much money getting invested in it. I mean, I think they run about $700 now, so that's why I say that's kind of the minimum if you're buying new.
Okay.
If I was talking to someone who knew for sure that they were getting into coffee and they were in it, for good, there's some other machines that I might recommend over that. That maybe a little bit more money, but certainly are going to be better machines and better investments.
Okay, so we're all a little bit lazy in today's world when it comes to shopping, and we all lean on and use the crutch of Amazon.
Oh, sure.
Is that a fair place to go look for, or would you have top 3 products that you could buy as far as a grinder? And maybe I'm hitting you on the spot to try to remember 2 or 3, but at least 1 or 2, maybe scale, grinder, kettle, something like that you would recommend. Or is there a brand with, that they can shop within that to find a couple different price points that you would say is quality?
So I would say for the grinder, the brand would be like Baratza is one of the ones that I mentioned. And I'm sure they're available on Amazon, but they're also available. I know Purify sells them. There's other online coffee retailers, and there's probably some other retailers in Houston if you want to keep it local.
And most bigger markets that would have.
Sure,
okay.
and pay a few more bucks, but support something local. But there's also some really good online stores. Seattle Coffee Gear is a really good online store. There's a couple more. I'll comment in the the comments to one of these posts where this episode goes up with some other ones that I'm blanking on. But there's some good online retailers. But as far as scales and kettles,
you made a point about the scales that if you get one, to make sure it has a timer.
I think it's nice to have a timer. Okay. I mean, our phones have them now too, so it's not the end of the world. Yeah. But mine has one. I think it's nice. It was like $15 off of Amazon. I couldn't tell you the brand because it's probably an off-brand.
Sure.
But it works. It's accurate. It goes down to 1/10 of a gram, which I think is good.
Scale not as important as the grinder. Grinder's the most important thing.
For sure. Okay. I wouldn't spend more than about $20 on a set of scales. There are $200 scales out there that are great, that will pair with your phone, give you all these graphs and stuff. They're really nice. The user interface and just the enjoyment of using them is going to be much higher. But at the end of the day, $20 will get you all you need in a scale if you're getting started. $40 to $50 will get you all you need in an electric kettle. And then after that, I would put the money into a grinder instead of really nice scales or really nice. I mean, there's $200-$300 kettles that you can get to, more enjoyable, maybe work better, look better, built better.
Your point for kettles is just quality, making sure you get something that lasts you a little while.
Right. And they don't, at the end of the day, it's just an electric element that's boiling
If it
water.
has some additional features on it, like yours does, that's nice, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, and the one that I brought over here doesn't really have a whole lot of it's variable temperature, and it will hold water at a certain temperature, which might be nice. Maybe a little bit wasteful from an energy standpoint, but if you turn it on and say I'm cooking breakfast and I want my water to be ready whenever it's time to make coffee, it'll hold it at whatever temperature you want, which is a nice little function. Other than that, there's really not a lot of bells and whistles on it, and I think it was $35, $40, something like that bucks on Amazon.
Okay, I'm just kind of going through this, picking your brain and equipment and things like that. Now I'm going to jump back to coffee real quick.
Okay.
Do you have some favorite countries or producers within those countries that maybe not now getting down to producers, that might be a different show, but just countries that you like coffee from? I know that when you mentioned Ethiopia and went, if it's from there, I want to go get it.
Yeah. So Central America and Africa are my two favorite regions.
Okay.
So that would be Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala. I'd put Colombia in that as well.
Ecuador?
Haven't had a ton of coffee from Ecuador, but there is some good stuff out there. Peru as well. There's some good coffees from. Brazil, I mentioned, makes a ton of coffee. It's a bit of a minefield because they make both really great coffee and really cheap commodity coffee. But you will see some quality lots from reputable roasters that Brazil, their coffee typically is less acidic, more of the kind of caramel and nuts and chocolate type thing. So if that's your thing, that might be a perfect one. And then in Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, those three just make fantastic coffee. Okay. Ethiopia is kind of the home of coffee. That's where it was believed to have first kind of evolved. And there are still what they call heirloom or indigenous, I guess you could say, varieties of coffee in Ethiopia they're still discovering that have over time kind of mutated into other subspecies. So really, really cool coffees coming out of there. But there are plenty of people that love the coffees of Asia, so Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, places like that, South America. I mean, generally speaking, coffee grows along the equatorial belt. You don't really get it outside of that. Mexico, a lot of great coffee as well. I didn't mention them, but they do have a lot of good coffee. Yes. They are, I've got my list here. They're the number 9 producer of coffee. So the top 10 by production is Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Honduras, India, Uganda, Mexico, and Guatemala. So by just weight of coffee produced, those are the top 10.
That's volume.
By volume. Not necessarily quality, but volume.
Say, if you gave top 3, top 5 for quality out of those regions.
That's just a big personal.
Okay, it is.
Point of, I mean,
but
one
Vietnam,
of them.
And I was asking that question leading to Vietnam because
Vietnam, India, Uganda aren't generally known for the highest quality. Indonesia as well. It can be really good coffee from Indonesia, but it's more of a volume producer.
Okay.
For example, one of our kind of American slang terms for coffee is Java, that comes from Indonesia, because there was so much coffee that came out of there. That was one of the first, quote, single origins that Americans really learned about, and that's why it kind of started becoming called Java. But as far as quality on that list, Colombia, they're probably both high volume and high quality. Ethiopia, also high volume, high quality. Guatemala, and then Honduras, and then Costa Rica is not on the top 10 list, but I think they make some great coffee. Kenya. So those are my personal favorites. What's difficult about coffee is, unlike wine, where I can say I really love this region and I love these producers within that region, coffee can be all over the place. And you can have coffees from this first one from Colombia that was super fruity. You can have another Colombian that tastes nothing like that.
Okay.
So the country is not necessarily indicative of
kind of reminds me
style.
of wine, because you can be in a vineyard and have a certain style of wine quality, and throw a rock and go over there and get the grapes, and it can be completely different.
Yep. And much like with wine, there's different varieties within the species. It's the same in coffee. So you may have different areas where they have either heirloom varieties, or they have certain varieties that just happen to grow better, or that's just what they've always grown. There are people out there that can tell varieties apart. I'm not a good enough coffee taster that I can tell you that one is one versus the other, but they do provide different things.
Well, I know we're going to get ready to wrap this up, but I'm looking forward to doing another episode and diving a little deeper, because you'd mentioned, like wine, we think about mountain fruit and quality that it produces. You kind of had a conversation with me about it's the same in coffee, or similar in coffee. And then you just made a comment about what'd you say?
Single origin.
Single origin, which I have no idea what that means, but we'll save that for, unless you want to.
It's just a term in specialty coffee that means that you can pinpoint it down to, at a minimum, a country, but generally even closer to that, even to maybe in Africa, a lot of times it'll be by a washing station. So you'll have a lot of farmers. One of the cool things about coffee is, for the most part, these are just family farmers. They're not, big with vineyards. A lot of times it's very wealthy individuals that own these big estates. A lot of times these are very, very poor people that are just growing coffee because that's what their family's always done,
farmers
on a hillside in Africa or something. And they're taking their coffee maybe to a central washing station that's all being processed together. So you may buy one that's from a certain washing station in Ethiopia, or you may be able to track coffee down to an individual farmer in Colombia. And so that's a single origin, much like single vineyard and wine. Okay. You can trace it to a specific plot.
State grown.
That's right. Yep. Yeah. So that's just a sign of quality. The more, I think you mentioned this in one of the breaks, that the more specific you can get on a label, generally the better the quality is going to be.
Absolutely.
Same in coffee.
Same in coffee. Okay. Yep. Okay. Well, this has been a fun episode. I'm hoping to have you back. If you'll come back, and we'll dive a little deeper into some things. If you're
happy to.
Yeah, that'd be great. If you're not a member of our Facebook group, it's same name as the podcast, Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. We're going to advertise and maybe have some conversations in there and get some threads going. So if you're interested in posting something and get in on that conversation, definitely come join the group. We'd love to have you, and we'll be back again with another episode of this subject of coffee. I think it's great. Tyler, thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour.